So now please welcome very warmly our first guest, Dayanita Singh. Hello. Dayanita, as we discussed yesterday, I thought you wanted to talk about the point d'ironie today and continue what started last night, because we had a conversation last night about your most recent publication, which we launched, the point d'ironie, and I think it's going to be around here today as well. Can you tell us about this ongoing dissemination?
I think it was one of the most moving events that happened in my life last night after you released the point of irony issue, when the five of us, Sudarshan, Avi, Kumi and John, walked through the Art Summit, just handing out these magazines, portfolios, my tribute to literature to people, some who were delighted, some who said no, as though it was a special offer that they didn't want, as I have often said to people on the street. And Hans Ulrich handed them to each security person. It was incredible. It's something I had dreamt would happen someday with work, but I didn't know it would be so moving. At the end of it, I was actually in tears in the car.
And can you tell us, maybe for those who weren't here yesterday, about this issue of the point d'ironie, because it sort of marks your very strong connection to literature, something which has been in your work from the very beginning. You also said yesterday your advice to a young photographer is to read all these books, actually, which you mention in the point d'ironie.
Yes, I think more and more I see the limitations of photography, that photography in itself, if one starts to look for references within photography, it's very limited, and it sort of finishes quite early on. So perhaps in all the arts, but certainly in photography, I think you really have to look to the other arts. And for me, literature has become more and more important, and I thought instead of having this issue be of just my photographs, I've made it so that my photographs are the covers for some of the books that I feel have shaped me. So the first image, Calvino's seminal book, for me the most important book for certainly photographers, but also anyone involved in the arts to read, more important than Roland Barthes and Susan Sontag. So the issue, and when you asked me at the end what was the advice to young photographers, it's really not about equipment and going to photo school, it's about reading, and I hope that can also be at least my contribution to a possible reading list, and everyone of course will find their own lists and disciplines to go into, but photography in itself is not enough.
And I was wondering, in terms of photography, because whenever I interview scientists, I remember the day, for example, I interviewed Albert Hofmann, the man who invented LSD. He remembered the moment of epiphany when he made his great discovery, and I was somehow wondering, in terms of your work, if you could tell us about your epiphany, how you came to photography, or how photography came to you.
My epiphany is quite well known. It will be a repetition for most of the people here. An event like this, or a music concert actually, Ravi Shankar and Zakir Hussain playing in Ahmedabad. I had just got a camera, class assignment to photograph moods of a person. I thought, great. I photograph Zakir Hussain, get onto the night train to Bombay and go and have a party all weekend, and I'll be ahead of the whole class. So everything was going as per plan, but when I stood up to take the picture, the organizer nudged me and I fell. And I was 18 and I fell on my backside and I was completely shattered. It was like the worst thing that could have happened in my life, to fall in front of 500 people. So I waited outside for Zakir to come out. This was early 80s, he wasn't such a big star, and when he came out after the concert, there wasn't a mob around him. I shouted across saying, "Mr. Hussain, today I'm a young student, someday I'll be an important photographer, and then we'll see who pushes me down." And that was it. I realized that I had chanced upon something that would free me from all kinds of social obligations, that would really allow me to make my own connection to the world and not follow a prescribed format. So it was really my ticket to freedom, and that was very specific in that push. So I often wonder, if the organizer hadn't pushed me, what would have happened?
And that whole idea of chance, I spoke with Gerhard Richter the other day about chance and the notion of controlled chance, and John Cage. And you very often talk about chance. I mean, also the beginning of color in your work had to do with chance. We were waiting for somebody for our portrait photography, and the person didn't show up, and then you all of a sudden actually, I think.
Yes, I think, I mean, if I start to talk about those events in my life, it sounds like I'm part of a Hindi film, because everything seems to be this amazing coincidence. I had gone to photograph Rahul Bajaj, Fortune magazine, family portraits, what I was known for, what I was hired for, and you know, I was standing there with my Hasselblad, with 2 extra cameras, everything, because I had an idea how a male industrialist might look at me, and this was just 4 or 5 years ago. Camera on a tripod, lights, really photographer, shouting photographer everywhere. And he came to me and he said, "Hello Dayanita, very nice to meet you. Thank you for sending your book, Privacy, Beautiful Photographs. Where's your photographer?" And I said, "Mr. Bajaj, I am the photographer. I sent you my book." And then he looks down at my belly and he looks at the Hasselblad and he says, "You are going to take my photograph with that antique camera?" So I was absolutely horrified and wanted to storm out of there. And then I just remembered all my visions of the Bajaj scooter, and I thought, this is the man who has made the romance of the Bajaj scooter. And then, to top it all, he said, "Actually, the children are not back from school, his grandchildren, so would you like to go and look at my factory?" And it was actually exactly like you said, another epiphany moment where I said, "Mr. Bajaj, I'm not a factories photographer. I make family portraits, and that's what I'm here for." And then I thought, why am I getting aggressive with this man who's made scooters his whole life? So I went to the factory, 10,000 scooters parked in front of me. My jaw dropped. I had never seen a scene like that in my life. And that's how the industrial work started, which then led to color.
And yesterday we talked a lot about this idea of, I mean, Gilbert and George would really call it art for all. This idea that there are other spaces and other circuits for art than the galleries and the museums, and that art and photography can go out there, and something you described last night by your books and the dissemination.
Yeah,
is that something you had from the beginning, this idea of art for all, or was there an epiphany for that?
You know, there I have to say that I think it's my origins in photojournalism that really made that very clear to me, because when in the days that I used to work as a photojournalist, if I did a story for The Independent, it was on the cover, there were 10 to 15 to sometimes, if you were lucky, even 20 pages, what we would call a photo essay. And that meant that thousands or hundreds of thousands of people got to see the image. So I was used to my images having that kind of access. And then when I moved away from photojournalism and went more into the gallery world, it was always, 500 people, 1,000 people. It was a bit disappointing, and it took me a long time to understand that that's where it comes from photojournalism, from understanding that what I really appreciate about photography is the dissemination that is possible with it. And last night absolutely proved that point.
Now, dissemination has obviously also changed through digital photography. And you were mentioning your Hasselblad camera. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the cameras you use now. And I was also curious if the kind of whole digital age has changed anything for you.
I have a special camera, and it's called Calvino. That's my camera. I don't think it would make any difference whether it was digital or film or medium format or large format. I think it's about what's in the head and what informs what's in the head, and for many years now it's been Calvino, so I think it's not fair to even quote Hasselblad. It's Calvino who deserves that credit.
So it's an homage to your hero, really, Italo Calvino.
Yeah. Yes.
And can you tell us about Calvino? Because you say often that for you it's the most important writer. What is it about Calvino which inspires you so much?
I find that with each book, each essay, he's changing the format. He's reinventing the novel. He's reinventing the short story. But if you read his 6 memos for the next millennium, that's like a guidebook for all artists, or maybe for all people, about lightness, about crispness, about gravitas, about the classical. He covers the entire gamut. I do go to other writers as well, and Michael Ondaatje, who I think is the master of withholding, restraint. So I find that it's not just what Calvino writes, but it's how he writes, how he challenges himself again and again and again. There's just no formula there.
And can you tell us what's the most recent work, the work you created most recently with Calvino? What has been the most recent photograph?
I think this aspect of fiction that is coming into the work with, say, even Museum of Innocence, and even though it's from reading Pamuk's Museum of Innocence that I made that piece that you saw at Lalit Kala, and I've inserted myself into the story, I think that that kind of sensibility and that kind of attitude, if you like, really comes from Calvino. It's not in the making of a single photograph. It's really how I approach whatever it is that I want to do. The issue we released yesterday, it wasn't just 8 titles and 8 photographs. You know, it was putting it there, taking it out, changing it again and again and again, to not let there be an apparent structure. I can never get a hold on Calvino.
So that's why it's endless. It continues.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And we spoke about your photography. There is obviously also your work with moving image. And the poet Czesław Miłosz, whom I interviewed when he was almost 100 years old, the Nobel Prize-winning poet, we went to Krakow with Philippe Parreno to talk to him. And he said that he thinks that everybody in the 20th century, everybody somehow in the 20th century was influenced by cinema.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about, because we spoke about literature, photography, what are your influences from cinema? And if you could tell us also about your own work with moving image, which is now also appearing more and more in exhibitions, as you told me yesterday.
I earlier used to think that my influence in cinema came from the black and white, Guru Dutt, in color, guide. And then when I made Dream Villa, I felt I knew a certain visual language. And then I watched, for those of you who may remember, the great seduction scene in Jewel Thief, Tanuja, Raat Akeli Hai. And I thought, oh my God, it's this kind of lurid color that I have been thinking, I'm exploring, I'm finding, and it was already there in Raat Akeli Hai and Jewel Thief. So I think initially it may have been a few directors that I thought of, but cinema is almost second nature, so it's so embedded in us. I can't even say when something entered. I watched Stalker suddenly, and I realized, obviously I couldn't have made Blue Book without watching Stalker, but it wasn't obvious in my head. These things just permeate into your being.
And are there any unrealized films you have, or unrealized projects with moving image?
Oh, plenty.
Do you ever thought of doing a feature film? Or?
No. I could never work with anybody else. I have to work alone. It has to be a very solitary thing for me. But what I enjoy very much now is projections.
Yeah.
So moving in that direction, but no, never cinema.
Now, one thing I was also curious is the idea of the museum and the context where art is shown, because yesterday we spoke about your kitchen museum, we spoke about your idea of a house museum in Goa, and I was wondering, many artists say in India there is a lack of public institutions. There's an amazing energy in terms of the market, and there is a lacking support of public institutions. So I was wondering, what would be kind of your dream museum? How would you imagine a cultural institution for the 21st century? Last night Barty Kerr said a good question would be, if you would be cultural minister, what would you change? What kind of institution would you imagine?
I can't really think that big, but I feel I already have the finest museum in Calcutta, on Park Street, in the shop window of Satram Das Jewellers, where Center Letter lies in what were his empty vitrines. This has been there since December 2008, I think. For those of you who know Calcutta and Park Street, you can imagine how many people walk past that work every day. The Panwala has taken it upon himself to be the guide to that work. The books are covered in dust. And I'm very happy with that. My dream is to actually be on the footpath outside India Museum, where they sell the posters of the gods and the film stars. And then if my image could be there, which I tried with the Indian Highway image and didn't quite succeed, but if my image could be on the footpath, that's more than any museum for me.
Yeah, of course, with the Indian Highway image, it became wallpaper and it could have filled entire museums. It became...
I tried to make a calendar where we sold 10 at the Serpentine and the rest 990 was sold in Dharavi in Bombay as a way to take an image back to Dharavi rather than Dharavi, which is always sending the images out. I tried to sell a few in my exhibition in Delhi, but there were no takers because it was a calendar. But it was the same image that people wanted as a limited edition. So it was a bit all quite confusing.
Now, one maybe last question I wanted to ask you is, we never really spoke about politics. And in India, very often, when I did interviews, artists mentioned that they would also be activists. So there's very often a parallel reality of art and activism. And as far as I understand, that's not something which for you has been necessarily important, but it's another form of activism. Could you talk about this and what kind of connection you have to
really no
politics?
I don't have a connection to politics or activism in the traditional sense, and someone tries to say your work is feminist or your work is something else. I'm not comfortable in any of those categories. The cliched thing. I do what I do. I do it for myself. I do it for a few people that I love, and the rest is a wonderful bonus.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dayanita. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And now it's the moment, I think, to distribute the point d'ironie, no?
Yes, absolutely.
So Dayanita will continue this idea of disseminating and distributing the point d'ironie.
Is my box open?